So last class, you all should have cut out your individual slabs. Okay? If you did not do this, make sure you get this done today, because you gotta get this done. With the clay, okay, when the clay is fresh, it is really wet, okay, which means it's very bendy. So if your slabs are too wet and you try to kind of construct with them, that flimsiness, that bendiness is going to make things a little bit trickier for you. So that's why we really wanted to get everything done a day before. So if you start connecting everything together, you're not going to have slabs that are going to just like flop on you. Shorter ones like this, because it doesn't have that much height to it, they're not really going to flop a lot. But let's say you're creating a box like this where you have, 6 by 6 inch sides. Okay, that's 6 inch height. If you try to stand it upright, if it's too flimsy, it's just going to bend on you right away. Okay, so that's really the main reason why we kind of did that first and waited that day. Okay, so questions on that? So as far as today, we are going to talk about two things. We're going to start talking about decorating your slabs for your container, but then also the construction. Okay, so I'm going to start with the decorating part. So depending on what your design is, carving, applique, stamping, pressing objects into the clay, all of that can be what you do. Depending on what your design is, it might be more beneficial to do your designs before you actually start constructing. For others, you would build your piece first and then add your decorations. So, carving and stamping. Okay, so if that is what you have in mind for carving and stamping, that is what you want to do first. So before you start putting all your walls up, you would do all of your carving and your stamping first. Because if you have, your piece all built, if you try to stamp things into the clay, it's going to be really hard to support your walls and not have everything fall apart on you. It'll be easier to have all your pieces individual, do your stamp, 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 go from there. Same with carving. Okay, so if you want to do any carving techniques, okay, or even pressing clay tools into the surface, so similar to stamping, it's a lot easier to have your pieces individual and flat. Okay, with applique, depending on what you're doing, we can talk about this one-on-one. If you're doing something very extravagant, I would make your whole container first and then do your applique. Okay. If you're doing something a little bit more basic, and I'll show you some examples where it isn't anything that's too lifted up, doesn't have too much volume, you can try to do some of that before you start to attach. Okay. So it's kind of a decide what your best route is. For most of you probably, I would do the majority of your decoration before you actually build. Having talked to you all one-on-one, a lot of you have at least carving. So carving would be kind of the first thing you do. All right, does that make sense? That order? All right. So with your decorations, okay, I'm going to show you some examples of what not to do and what you can do. Okay, so here I have my design. So I just have this cubed box, okay, and I just want this striped pattern. Okay, so very basic, nothing too exciting. Okay, kind of boring, honestly. Student instinct. So from all the years I've been teaching, student instinct with a design like this is to simply just take a stick and just carve your lines and say, I'm done. Okay? No, this is not acceptable. Okay? This is not really showing all the skills that I know you all have. Okay? It's boring, it's flat, it literally took like seconds to do. Okay? So this is what we want to avoid. Okay? So you must be thinking, well, how can I translate this design into something more interesting? Well, one way to do that is to vary your carving thicknesses. Okay? So in this example here, I have just a regular stick line, but then I also used my ribbon tool, this tool, to carve those thicker lines. Okay? So all of a sudden I have some variation. Okay? So that's one of our principles that we talked about, is variation. Okay? So I have a variation in thickness, so how thick the lines are, so thick, thin, okay? But also a variation in depth, so how deep those lines go. Okay? So all of a sudden, by just changing up some of my clay tools, I was able to make this kind of bland stripe a little bit more interesting. Okay? It didn't take much. Okay? I'm still essentially doing the same thing, okay? But it just adds a little bit more interest. Okay? Another thing you can do, so let's say you want to just have those stripes like that, but what if all of a sudden you add decoration in between? So instead of having just these plain, boring bands, what if you alternate nothing and then add some sort of texture, then nothing, add some sort of texture, nothing, add some sort of texture. Okay? So you're still working with that pattern and repetition, but you're adding that extra element of interest. Okay? So for this, okay, I just drew out all my stripes, and then I went in with one of my clay tools, I think it was this one, okay, and I just pressed it in like that. Okay. Press. Okay. Are we seeing the difference so far between kind of our basic one and starting to get a little bit more interest? You still have the same idea coming across, but it's elevated. Okay. It has more of that design quality. Okay. Here is a little bit of a mix of the two. Okay. So with this one, okay, I drew out my stripes, okay, and then what I did is every other stripe, I went ahead and I carved it out. Okay. So I have lifted stripe, then kind of pressed in stripe, lifted stripe, pressed in stripe, lifted. Okay. So once again, same idea, but you're starting to have more interest. Okay? And then for added pizzazz, you know, you could do different textures throughout, or you could leave them just blank. Okay? So that's kind of basic carving. On the opposite end, if you want to do applique, you can do that too. Okay? So here, with this one, I'll go side to side this way. Okay? I have my flat slab, okay, so my basic slab. I drew out my lines, okay, but then I added onto the surface additional slabs to lift it up, to give it height. Okay, so here's my applique. So I made the stripes, I slipped and scored them properly, attached them. Okay? And from there, you know, you can leave them blank. You could add different textures, patterns, stamps to them to give them more pizzazz. Okay? But once again, same idea, that stripe pattern, but more advanced. Okay? So this was just regular slabs that I just sliced and diced. Okay? You can go back into our coils, okay, and applique different things to create your line. So instead of just that plain carved line, okay, you can just roll out a coil, slip and score it on. Roll out a coil, slip and score it on, add a texture. Okay. With these two, all right, this first one, I kind of dropped my line, and then I slipped and scored the little balls of clay to create this dotted line. Okay. I could have just put the dotted line there. I didn't necessarily have to draw out my line. I could have just attached those dots and it would have given the same effect. In this one here, I carved with my ribbon tool into the surface, and then I pressed those little balls of clay in there. Slipped and scored. Always, always slip and score. Okay? So that also gets variation. Okay? So just with applique, you can do a lot of stuff. Okay? So that's kind of the goal. So you want to avoid this plain, boring one. Okay? And you really want to explore different ways to make it more interesting and exciting. Okay? And you all can do it. I know you can. Okay? So if I see anyone with just something like this as their design, I'm gonna tell you to keep working on it and to make it more interesting. Okay? So you can easily do this with, you know, any of the designs. Okay? So let's say you wanted to do a bunch of circles as your pattern. Okay? So instead of just drawing circle, 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 circle over and over again, obviously making it a lot cleaner than what I'm doing. Okay? So instead of doing just like that and saying, I'm done, okay, you could carve some of these out. You could applique some of them to lift them. You could add textures to them. Okay? You could do any of these things to make them interesting. Another thing you can do is you could just have variety. So variety will be your friend. Okay? So you can vary the size. Okay? So even if you're doing stripes, okay, you could have some stripes that are thicker, some stripes that are thinner. Okay? So that right there, a little bit more interesting than that. And then I could go in and give, you know, some personality. It doesn't mean that every single one has to be completely different. Okay? If you want to go in and just carve everything out, okay, you can definitely do that. Okay? You don't have to have a different personality for like every little thing. Okay? So you want to have some uniform between, so that unity, but also variety, if that makes sense. Okay? So questions on that? Okay? And I can work with you one-on-one if you're not sure how you can kind of change things up, make things a little bit more interesting as far as what you do with your designs. Okay? All right, so next we're going to talk stamping. So maybe there is some sort of texture you want to create or do. You can easily use your clay tools. Okay? Press, 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 create texture. So we talked about this with our first project when we were doing the tile. Okay? But you can also just stamp things in. So I have this whole series of clay stamps and rollers. So they're going to be up here at the table that you can use. So it's a very random assortment of stuff, but you are more than welcome to use them. So the stamps work just like stamps. Okay? You literally just press it into the clay. Okay? And that will give you that texture. You can use any object to do this. So I have seashells. So if you are doing kind of an under the sea themed, you can press seashells into the surface. If you're doing something nature-y, we can go pull rocks from outside, press them into your clay to get texture. any of that stuff. Okay. We have these rollers, okay, that literally you're kind of rolling into the surface to get your texture. Okay. With the rollers, the only caveat is that sometimes it can distort your overall shape a little because you're pressing down. So just be conscious of that. You might have to kind of trim things down a little bit later. But those are kind of our little stamps that you can use. Okay. So questions? Any of that? No. Try stuff out. If you're not sure what to do, grab random slab. You can roll out a thin slab just with the rolling pins at your tables and try different stuff. Okay, it's easier to try it on something that's practice, so like sketch paper essentially, than doing it on your final piece, deciding you don't like it, and then having to remake that side. Okay, so try stuff before if you're not quite sure what route you want to go.